Do you believe in forgiving or forgetting?
At our family reunion, everyone stood up to clap when Kyle raised his wine glass and delivered what he probably thought was a humble brag disguised as gratitude, thanking Grandma for the potato salad and his boss for believing in his leadership potential. The folding chairs creaked, someone whistled, and Aunt Sheila wiped a tear from under her mascara-thick lashes like she was watching her son graduate from NASA training instead of just getting bumped to Vice President of Product Strategy at some tech firm with bean bags in the conference room. I didn't clap. I was in the kitchen, scraping the remnants of spinach dip into the trash and rinsing out red Solo cups that still smelled faintly of vodka and cranberry. That's just what I do at these things: fade into the wallpaper, clean the mess, keep my mouth shut. Only this time I didn't. The truth is, the whole reunion had started off like every other one: forced hugs at the door, comments about my new haircut that wasn't new, and the slow buildup of praise around Kyle like bees orbiting a sugar stick. Aunt Sheila had set the tone early, introducing him to every third cousin twice removed with, "This is our Kyle, just got promoted to VP. Can you believe it?" The answer was always yes, and always followed by some variation of, "He's always been so driven." No one asked me how work was. I wasn't surprised. Being self-employed and childless in a family like mine is basically like being invisible, unless someone needs help moving a table. So I moved tables. I cut watermelon. I kept a mental tally of every little favor I did that nobody saw. I smiled while Sheila made passive digs about how some people just find their lane later in life. I laughed when Kyle joked about my old Saturn Ion still holding on after 2 decades. It wasn't worth starting anything. It never had been. But something shifted around the third glass of Pinot Grigio when I sat down next to Grandma on the shaded side of the deck, and she leaned in like she had a secret marinating in her chest. Grandma Joyce doesn't gossip much, but when she does, there's usually something sharp under the soft. She took a slow sip of her iced tea and said, "Kyle's lucky people forget things," and then, just like that, she got up to go back inside, muttering something about needing her sweater. I sat there, blinking, the wind brushing my face, and that sentence echoed in my mind like a drip in a quiet room. Lucky people forget things. It didn't make sense. Unless it did. Unless she wasn't talking about random memory loss, but something she assumed I hadn't forgotten either. And she was right. About 10 minutes later, I followed her into the house under the pretense of needing more plastic forks, but really, I just wanted to see. Kyle's laptop was on the kitchen counter, plugged into the charger, lid half closed. Nobody else was inside. Aunt Sheila was still holding court near the grill, Kyle was playing football on the lawn with the younger cousins, and Grandma was sitting in the living room watching reruns of Wheel of Fortune on mute. I opened the laptop. No password. Of course not. Kyle probably assumed everyone in the house was too dumb or too polite to snoop. It booted straight up into an email tab, and at the top of the inbox was a thread labeled, "Promotion Justification Final." I know I shouldn't have clicked it. I should have closed the lid, poured myself a Sprite, and gone back outside. But I didn't. Because something about the self-satisfied look on Kyle's face all day made me itch. That smug, empty grin, the way he always knew people were watching and always said the right thing at the right time. I'd lived 3 decades in this family, watching him get away with everything while the rest of us picked up scraps of validation. So I clicked. And what I found wasn't illegal, but it was dirty. An email chain between Kyle and someone named Mark, his supervisor, where they discussed the sudden termination of Jake Winston, who used to work with Kyle back at Fusion Tech. Jake was apparently underperforming on a team project that had gone sideways, and Kyle had stepped up to restructure deliverables and proposed a streamlined vision, which made him look like a savior in the eyes of upper management. But the dates didn't lie. I remembered that project. I remembered when Jake came to Thanksgiving 2 years ago, sitting next to Kyle at the table, laughing like they were brothers. They weren't just coworkers, they were friends. The worst part wasn't that Kyle got promoted by throwing Jake under the bus. The worst part was the tone. There was a line in one of the emails Kyle wrote. He didn't have VP energy. Like ambition was a birthright and kindness a liability. I took a screenshot with my phone, just one, and closed the laptop. I wiped the screen with the hem of my shirt and set it down gently right where I'd found it. When I walked back outside, Kyle was holding court again, this time telling some story about closing a $1 million deal. Everyone clapped at the punchline. Aunt Sheila dabbed at her eyes again like Kyle's success was a shared inheritance. I stood by the porch steps, phone in my pocket, and looked at each of them like they were actors in a badly directed play. I didn't say anything. Not yet. I just smiled and asked Sheila, as she passed me a plate of baked beans, "Hey, did Jake ever find a new job after that thing at Fusion Tech?" Her hand froze for half a second, then kept moving, like she was willing her brain to ignore what it had just heard. "What thing?" she asked. "Oh, I don't know," I said. Kyle mentioned there was some kind of fallout. "Poor Jake." I said it sweetly. As sweetly as I could manage without laughing. And then I turned and walked away, the beans untouched in my hand. Because now, the game had started. And I wasn't just taking out the trash anymore. I was sorting the whole damn house. Back outside, the afternoon sun had taken on that lazy, golden hue it always does right before dinner, when the air thickens with barbecue smoke, laughter rises with the heat, and everyone leans back in their lawn chairs like they've earned the right to be content. Kyle was leaning against the picnic table, holding a beer bottle like it was a microphone, laughing loudly at something Uncle Ron had said, one of those forced belly laughs he always used to dominate a room, or a yard, or a life. Aunt Sheila was already circling the folding tables again, offering seconds to people who didn't want them and praising the beautiful turnout. She had orchestrated like it was a corporate event and not just Grandma's backyard with mismatched chairs and overcooked sausages. I stood off to the side, pretending to stir the macaroni salad, but really I was just thinking too fast and too hard, trying to slow my heart rate down and process what the hell I had just seen. The email wasn't a bombshell in the traditional sense. No smoking gun, no outright confession of fraud, nothing that would land Kyle in court or on the news. But it didn't need to be criminal to be rotten. It was the casualness of it all, the cold, corporate shorthand he used to discuss Jake like he was dead weight, a liability, a name to be trimmed off a spreadsheet. There had been lines like, "Winston's erratic approach compromised the vision," and "I took initiative in reallocating deliverables," phrases so polished and bloodless they sounded like they belonged in a quarterly report, not a conversation about ending someone's livelihood. What hit me hardest, though, was the timestamp. It was from 8 months ago. That was right around the time Jake had stopped returning texts. I hadn't even realized how long it had been since I'd seen his name pop up on my phone. It wasn't until that moment, staring at Kyle's screen in Grandma's kitchen, that I remembered how quiet he had gone and how loud Kyle had become. I didn't know Jake all that well, just enough to know he didn't deserve to be gutted like that. He was the kind of guy who over-explained things because he cared, not because he thought you were dumb. He wore shirts that were always a little wrinkled and called everyone buddy, even if he'd just met them. He had this goofy, nervous energy that made him hard not to like, which probably annoyed Kyle more than he ever let on. Kyle didn't like people who weren't trying to win. Jake wasn't trying to win, he was just trying to work and be decent and laugh at dumb stuff, like he didn't know how close the wolves were circling. I don't know if they were ever truly close, Kyle and Jake. But they shared beers, shared emails, shared trust. And Kyle had used that trust like a ladder, then kicked it away once he was high enough that no one could hear the crash when Jake hit the ground. As I stood there, holding the serving spoon and staring into the slick mess of mayonnaise and elbow noodles, I felt that familiar tightness in my throat, the one I always get when something unfair slides by the world unnoticed. My whole life, I've watched people like Kyle float up and people like Jake sink without a sound. And I've watched people like me, helpers, cleaners, go-betweens, get thanked when it's convenient and forgotten when it's not. I've spent entire holidays driving Grandma to doctor's appointments and still gotten sad at the kids' table. I've proofread resumes, watched people's dogs, remembered birthdays that no one remembered back. And somehow, I've always swallowed it down with a polite smile and a store-bought pie, because that's what you do in families like ours. You keep the gears greased even when they grind you up. But now I had something more than anger. I had evidence. Not enough for a scandal, but enough to whisper. And whispering can be its own kind of fire. I made my way back inside while most of the family had migrated to the far side of the yard, gathering around Kyle again like satellites. I slipped into the kitchen without being noticed, as usual, and picked up the laptop again, not because I needed to see more, but because I needed to be sure. There was a second thread, one I hadn't noticed at first, buried under a subject line that read, HR Notes, Confidential. My stomach turned as I clicked. This one wasn't from Kyle. It was from someone named Rachel G. Someone in human resources, probably addressed to a few higher-ups at Fusion Tech. And Kyle had clearly forwarded it to himself. That's what made my skin crawl. It was a breakdown of complaints against Jake, interpersonal friction, inconsistent output, team misalignment. It all read like a carefully built case against someone who didn't know they were being tried. And Kyle had gathered it, compiled it, framed it. He didn't just push Jake, he planned it. I stood there in the kitchen, barely breathing, heart thudding in my ears, as I took one long screenshot after another, careful, quiet, methodical. I didn't know what I would do with them yet, but I knew I wasn't putting that laptop down until I had them. I wasn't going to rely on my memory alone. I wasn't going to gaslight myself into thinking maybe it wasn't as bad as it looked. Because it was. It was a blueprint for betrayal, and Kyle had built it with the precision of someone who'd done it before. When I finally stepped away from the counter, I felt lightheaded, like I'd surfaced too fast from underwater. I tucked my phone into my back pocket, rinsed my hands in the sink like I'd just touched something dirty, and walked out the back door like nothing had happened. Kyle was across the yard, holding court near the fire but now, laughing with that open-mouthed expression he always used when he wanted people to think he was having a great time. Aunt Sheila was watching him from her chair, eyes shining with pride, holding a glass of rose like it was communion wine. And I was done being invisible. But not loud. Not yet. Not the kind of revenge that smashes windows. No, I wanted the kind that cracked foundations, slow and silent. The kind that you don't see until the walls are tilting and no one remembers where the first fracture came from. So I smiled as I approached the table, refilled a bowl of chips, and waited for just the right moment. Because I already knew the first match had been struck. The fire, when it came, would look accidental. Almost natural. And by the time anyone realized what had happened, they'd be too busy pointing fingers to notice I'd been standing in plain sight the whole time. The hours that followed moved in that strange, stretchy way time does when you're holding on to a secret that could, with just a few words, shatter the carefully balanced performance unfolding around you. I floated through the motions of the family reunion like someone underwater, smiling when appropriate, offering paper towels to sticky-handed children, nodding through another one of Aunt Sheila's breathless monologues about Kyle's new Tesla subscription plan like I hadn't just read a digital trail of calculated betrayal that he'd left open like a glass of warm milk. It was almost comical, really, how quickly everything around me resumed its rhythm, unaware that my pulse had shifted entirely into a sharper, more deliberate tempo. The lie was still standing, propped up by Chardonnay, Costco cheese trays, and half-hearted small talk, and I was the only one who had walked through the scaffolding and seen the mold in the foundation. I kept watching Kyle, waiting not for him to slip up, because someone like him never does without intention, but for the crack to show behind the charm, that one moment when he'd lock eyes with me and realize something had changed. That I wasn't the same background figure who once helped his mother carry in boxes of party favors or drove 2 hours to babysit their dog when they were out of town. That version of me was still standing in the yard, smiling, nodding, making herself useful, but underneath the surface, something colder had taken root, something sharper, and it was just waiting for an opening. That opening came just after dinner, as the sun dipped low enough to bathe the yard in that soft, deceitful light that makes everything look prettier than it really is. People were still sitting around their plates, talking over each other, the cousins tossing beanbags near the shed, and Aunt Sheila had started pouring dessert wine like she was hosting a retirement cruise. I waited until her glass was halfway full, until her attention was delightfully distracted by her own performance, and then I struck, not loudly, not dramatically, just one soft sentence laid down like a tripwire. "Hey, Sheila," I said casually, taking a bite of potato salad I didn't want. Did Jake ever land on his feet after fusion tech? It must have hit him hard, huh? It was almost musical, the way her face changed in slow motion, the casual warmth giving way to something taut and calculated, the slow lift of her eyes toward mine as if trying to measure how much I knew and how much I was bluffing. Her fingers tightened ever so slightly around the stem of her glass, and her lips pressed together in a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Jake, she repeated, as if the name was unfamiliar, as if she needed a moment to summon the memory of someone who'd once sat across from her at Thanksgiving, carving turkey and laughing at her son's jokes like he didn't know there was a blade pointed at his back. Yes, Jake Winston, I continued, dipping my plastic fork into the macaroni salad with exaggerated calm. I remember you all were pretty close for a while. Kyle mentioned something about a falling out, something work-related. Shame how some people get left behind in the shuffle, huh? I didn't look at Kyle while I said it, but I didn't need to. I felt the shift in the air around me, the tiny ripple that passed through the conversation like a pebble thrown into still water. He was behind me, or beside me, or maybe just close enough to hear. It didn't matter. The seed was planted. The smile on Sheila's face had stiffened into a mask, and I could see her calculating, trying to decide whether to brush it off or dig deeper. But it was Kyle who came to find me 20 minutes later, when I'd escaped to the kitchen under the pretense of bringing in the empty ice bins. He followed me in like a shadow, closing the sliding door behind him with a softness that was more threatening than a slam. His voice, when it came, was low and tight and just a little too calm. "What was that outside?" he asked, his tone already laced with accusation, as if the balance of power between us hadn't already shifted. I didn't turn around right away. I let him stew in it. I rinsed my hands in the sink, dried them slowly on the towel, then turned and met his eyes with all the sweetness of a loaded gun. "Wasn't anything," I said, my voice even. "Just asking about a friend." Kyle took a step closer, and I could see it now, that flicker behind his eyes, the one that gave him away. Not panic. Not yet. But fear, maybe. Or rage. Or both, carefully balanced behind his teeth like a secret he'd chew before he'd let it escape. "Look," he said, "I don't know what you think you know, but dragging Jake into this? It's petty, Meg. You always had a thing for him. Don't let your feelings cloud your judgment." That was it. That was the moment. He thought he still had the upper hand. He thought he could psychoanalyze me into silence, twist the narrative into something embarrassing and personal and small. But he had no idea how much bigger this was than Jake, or him, or that stupid promotion. "Careful, Kyle," I said, stepping past him toward the fridge, as if I was grabbing a bottle of water and not slapping the table of his entire professional legacy. People remember things. Especially when they've been quiet for too long. His jaw clenched, and he opened his mouth like he wanted to say something, maybe to threaten, maybe to beg, maybe to scream, but I didn't give him the chance. I turned, met his stare, and tilted my head. "Funny how people forget what happened when you were 19, I said lightly, like I was talking about an old movie or a lost keychain, and then I walked out of the kitchen, leaving the smell of confrontation and lemon-scented cleaner behind me. I didn't look back, but I could feel it, something uncoiling in the silence, something shifting in the architecture of Kyle's carefully built life. And I knew, without needing confirmation, that he understood, that he remembered, that the thing he thought was buried had just been unearthed. And I, the one who had held that secret in the back of my mind for years like a stone in my shoe, was finally done limping. The phone call came that evening, just after the sky turned the color of overripe peaches and the yard began to empty, like someone had pulled a plug at the base of it, draining the chatter and plates and pretenses into the silence that always follows a family gathering once the performance has ended and only the leftovers remain. Most of the guests had packed up their folding chairs, kissed Grandma on the cheek, and waddled back to their sedans and SUVs with Tupperware stacked high and smiles stretched thin, the kind of smiles that vanish the moment the engine starts and the real conversations begin. Aunt Sheila had disappeared without a word, her earlier glow dulled by something heavy she hadn't yet named, and Kyle had vanished somewhere near the fire pit, his shadow long and still against the side of the house, like he was waiting for the night to cover what the sun had started to expose. I was in my childhood bedroom, converted now into a sort of catch-all storage space for boxes of forgotten photos, old Christmas decorations, and a twin bed that creaked under any real weight when the call came in. The number flashed up as Grandma Joyce, though I recognized the tone in her voice before I ever checked the screen. There was something about the way she said my name that told me the whole world had shifted, even if the house still stood and the furniture hadn't moved an inch. "Megan," she said, soft but trembling, like she was steadying herself against something I couldn't see. "What did you say to your aunt?" At first, I didn't answer. I could hear the television murmuring behind her, one of those crime procedurals she always kept on in the background, not really watching, just letting the voices fill the room. I could picture her sitting in her favorite chair, the one with the quilt draped over the back and the squeaky armrest she refused to fix. She wasn't the kind of woman to call in a panic, but something in her voice made my stomach knot. She wasn't angry. She was scared. I didn't say anything she didn't already know. I replied after a pause, walking slowly to the window and pulling the curtain aside to watch the darkness press up against the glass. I just reminded her. There was silence on the other end, broken only by the faint sound of footsteps and the muffled click of a door closing, probably her shutting herself away from the others, needing space to talk without being overheard. When she spoke again, her voice had changed. It was tighter now, more urgent, like she needed me to understand that the game we'd started had rules I was about to break. "She's been shaking since lunch," Grandma said. "She said you brought up something from the past. Something that was supposed to stay buried." I turned away from the window then, pacing the room with the phone pressed tight to my ear, trying to decide how much of the truth to give her, how much she already suspected and how much she had been trying not to see. Because the thing about secrets in families like ours is that they don't really stay hidden. They just get covered in polite silence and passed down like heirlooms, everyone knowing and pretending not to know. Until one person finally speaks the words aloud and the whole house starts to tremble. "She asked me not to tell anyone years ago," I said, my voice low and steady. "She said it would ruin Kyle's future. That he was just a kid. That it was a misunderstanding. But it wasn't. And she knows it." Grandma inhaled sharply, and for a second, I thought she might hang up, might decide it was easier not to know the full weight of what had been sitting in the attic of our family history, collecting dust and resentment. But she didn't. She stayed on the line, silent but present, which was all the permission I needed. "It wasn't just about Jake," I continued, sitting down on the edge of the bed as if grounding myself would stop the spin in my chest. "That email just lit the fuse. The truth is, I've been sitting on this for 12 years, and I'm tired of pretending Kyle's golden halo isn't just a reflection of everyone else cleaning up after him." There was a long pause then, long enough that I could hear the clock ticking on the wall behind me, each second marking the distance between the person I had been this morning and the one I had become by nightfall. "You're talking about the girl," Grandma finally said, her voice no longer unsure but weighted with something older, something heavy with memory and guilt. "From college. The one who transferred." I closed my eyes and let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. "She never pressed charges. She didn't want the attention. But I saw him put something in her drink. I saw her stumble out of that dorm room, crying, with her shirt inside out. And I saw Aunt Sheila, the very next morning, sitting on our front porch with a trembling voice and a casserole, asking me, begging me, not to say anything. Said Kyle would never get into grad school if this came out. Said boys make mistakes." Grandma didn't respond right away, and when she did, there was something cracked in her voice, like the sound of old wood giving way under too much weight. "And you stayed quiet all this time," she whispered. "Even when you watched them praise him over and over again." "I stayed quiet because I thought it would bring peace," I said. "Because I thought keeping the family together was more important than telling the truth. But today, seeing him smile like he's earned everything he's been given, I realized the peace was never mine to keep. I've been the one sacrificing for it, year after year." There was another silence, this one longer, heavier, and I wondered for a moment if I had gone too far, if even Grandma, the one person in the family who ever seemed to truly see me, would retreat back into the comfortable fog of denial. But then she said something I didn't expect. Something that lodged itself deep in my chest and would stay there long after the phone line went dead. You were 16 when you started driving me to my appointments. You were the one who stayed late after reunions to do the dishes. You were the one who held this family together, Megan, not Sheila. Not Kyle. You. And I'm sorry we let you carry that weight alone. I didn't know what to say, so I said nothing. Just let the warmth of her words push back, for a moment, against the cold bitterness that had settled into me. And now, she asked, what are you going to do with what you know? I looked down at my phone, then over to the desk drawer where I had stashed the printouts of Kyle's emails, the ones I had sent to my private account, just in case, and backed up 3 times over. I thought about Jake, about the girl who transferred, about every small injustice I had swallowed with a forced smile. I'm going to do what Aunt Sheila asked me to do, I said finally, my voice calm. I'm going to protect Kyle's future. There was a pause, and I knew she didn't understand, not yet. I'm going to protect everyone else from it. Then I hung up. The night after the reunion was thick with a kind of stillness that isn't truly quiet, the kind of suffocating hush that follows an emotional detonation when the world doesn't quite know how to react. When you walk through your own house like the air has changed density and gravity feels different on your skin. I couldn't sleep, not because of guilt or anxiety, but because my mind was pacing in circles around the same thought over and over again. It wasn't enough to shake the illusion, it had to be shattered completely. And shattered in a way that would leave pieces sharp enough to make anyone who tried to rebuild it bleed a little. There had been too many years of careful performance, too many holidays spent pretending Kyle's halo wasn't stolen, too many strained smiles from Grandma and frozen, empty apologies from Aunt Sheila offered in exchange for my silence. Like peace could be bought with casseroles and passive aggression. So I sat at my kitchen table in the dim yellow light of the overhead lamp, fingers poised over my phone, replaying the old file I had transferred from my backup folder earlier that week. The voicemail I had saved over a decade ago and hidden in a subfolder I labeled utility bills so no one would ever think to open it. The message wasn't long, barely 30 seconds, but it contained more weight than some court depositions. Aunt Sheila's voice was smaller back then, less composed, not yet the ironclad matriarch she had morphed into once Kyle's career had started climbing. She had left the message after driving over to our house unannounced, her mascara streaked, her hands shaking so badly she couldn't hold the coffee cup my mother offered her. It was the night after the girl from Kyle's dorm had come forward quietly, without press, without police, without demanding anything other than acknowledgement, and Sheila had known the risk, known that I had seen too much, and she'd chosen to plead, rather than confront. Her voice on the recording cracked around every syllable, like she was physically holding herself together just long enough to say the words. Megan, sweetheart, I know you're hurt and confused, she began, and I could still remember how angry I had been at the way she had framed my clarity as confusion, as if the thing I saw with my own eyes could be softened by motherly guilt and diluted truth. But please, don't tell anyone about what you saw. Kyle's just a kid, he didn't understand the consequences, and I promise, I'll make sure he gets help. He'll never do anything like that again. Please don't ruin his future. We'll make it up to you, I swear. That last sentence had lived inside me like a splinter for years, and no matter how many times I tried to let it go, it burrowed deeper. We'll make it up to you, as though what I had witnessed could be bartered for. As though my silence had a price tag that she was confident the family could afford. And for a while, I had let that splinter fester in silence, convincing myself that holding it in was maturity, that staying quiet was some act of emotional discipline, that the passage of time would erode the sharpness of it all and leave behind only dull, harmless memory. But it hadn't. The memory was still sharp. The silence had only calcified the injustice into something that bled every time I had to watch Kyle get another round of applause for the facade he wore like a tailored suit. I had sat through countless holidays, baby showers, birthdays, and Sunday brunches watching him take credit for things he never earned, watched my aunt beam at him like his every success justified every time she'd protected him, watched the family nod along as if nothing beneath the surface could possibly be more important than what was visible to guests. And now I had the voicemail, the receipt, the confession, the one final crack in the armor that, when timed right, could bring everything down with it. The emails I had forwarded to myself from his laptop, the HR notes, the manipulative threads, the polite sabotage of Jake Winston's career had already been quietly packaged and sent to someone I trusted more than anyone in that house ever realized, Jake himself. I didn't attach my name. I didn't need to. He would know. And I didn't need praise or recognition for it. I didn't need to watch Kyle's reputation unravel in real time. I just needed the record corrected, the scales tipped just enough to make the world feel a little less like a rigged game. That night, long past midnight, I finally shut off my phone and let the darkness of my bedroom wrap around me, not as a punishment, but as a kind of peace. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like a bystander in my own life. I didn't feel like the family errand girl who kept the machine running so others could smile and shine. I had done something. And maybe it was small. Maybe no one in the family would ever find out, or if they did, maybe they'd never believe it. But it didn't matter. Because Kyle knew. Aunt Sheila knew. And Grandma, well, Grandma understood more than she let on. 2 mornings later, the family group chat went strangely quiet. Normally flooded with memes, prayer hands, and Sunday church reminders, it sat frozen after one last message from Sheila that read simply, "Kyle is taking some time off work to reflect. Please be respectful of his privacy." There was no mention of Jake, no mention of Fusion Tech, no apologies, no explanations. Just a soft admission that something had gone sideways in Kyle's picture-perfect life, and no one was quite sure how to spin it. A few cousins sent polite emojis. My mother responded with, "Thinking of you." And I said nothing. I just watched the silence bloom and spread like a slow-growing mold, knowing that even if no one ever asked questions out loud, the doubt had been planted, the performance interrupted. That evening, as I walked through the neighborhood with a mug of coffee in hand, the summer air warm against my skin, I replayed the voicemail in my mind one more time, not because I needed the reminder, but because I wanted to mark the end of something. It was never really about revenge, not exactly. It was about finally choosing not to carry someone else's shame as if it were my own. It was about refusing to let the worst thing a person ever did become my burden just because I was the only one who had seen it. So no, I didn't ruin Kyle's future. I just made sure the past wasn't erased to serve his convenience. And maybe that's not justice in the traditional sense, but it was enough for me. Some families fall apart with fireworks and shouting matches. Ours would unravel in quiet phone calls, unread emails, and whispered speculation that could never be confirmed but would linger all the same. And in the end, maybe that's the most fitting punishment for people like Kyle and Sheila, not exposure, but doubt. Not being dragged into the light, but forever wondering how much people actually know, and who might still be watching from the shadows. Because the truth, once let loose, doesn't need to be loud. It just needs to be remembered.